Welcome to another episode. I believe this is episode 4 of season 2. Today I want to paint a picture that most of us recognize. And it's when people hear ADHD, they picture a child who can't sit still, who talks out of turn, who is tapping their pencil, who is out of seat every 5 minutes. And because that image is so dominant, it has completely shaped how ADHD is understood, how it's diagnosed, and how it's treated. But here's the truth. That version of ADHD is not the only one. And for millions of people, it's not even the main one. There is an entire population of people with ADHD who were never hyper. They were never disruptive. They were never hopping out of their seat, pinging off the walls. They were always compliant. They were probably exhausted. And they grew up believing that there was something wrong with them. So today we're talking about ADHD without the hyper. The ADHD that doesn't get noticed, doesn't get diagnosed. So what is ADHD? The DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that psychiatrists and psychologists use to diagnose mental disorders, back in the day had recognized attention deficit hyperactive disorder, ADHD, and attention deficit disorder, ADD, as two separate diagnoses. Presently, the DSM-5 categorizes both as ADHD, but with different presentations. So according to the DSM-5, ADHD is classified as a neurodevelopmental disorder. And why that matters is because it doesn't mean a lack of discipline or a personality flaw or a motivation problem. It means the brain developed differently, particularly in systems responsible for executive functioning. Executive functions are the brain's management tools, right? So it's responsible for starting tasks, for sustaining attention, for regulating emotions, managing time, holding information in working memory. Research consistently shows that ADHD involves delayed or altered development of the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for self-regulation. So this is not about intelligence, it's not about ability, it's about regulation. And contrary to its name, ADHD is not an attention deficit. And this is probably one of the most misunderstood things about ADHD. So people with ADHD do not lack attention. They lack the ability to control where their attention goes, how long it stays, and when it shifts. So studies using neuroimaging show that the dopamine pathways in ADHD brains function completely differently. So dopamine is the neurotransmitter responsible for motivation, for reward anticipation, for sustained effort. So this explains why you can hyper focus on something interesting for hours on end, but you can't start a simple, boring task, even if that task is very important or really matters. This is not about willpower, it's about neurochemistry.
Hi.
So as we said, there are now 3 different presentations of ADHD that are recognized by the DSM-5. And I want to take a minute to talk about these to give a better understanding. So number 1 is the predominantly inattentive presentation, which was formerly what they would have called ADD, or attention deficit disorder. This is the ADHD that is most often missed. So research shows that individuals with inattentive ADHD have greater difficulty with working memory, with sustained mental effort, and with task initiation. They're not distractible because everything pulls their attention. They struggle because attention doesn't stay anchored. Psychologically, this looks like zoning out, forgetting instructions, losing track of time, difficulty organizing thoughts, mental fatigue from everyday tasks. So studies estimate that up to 50 to 75% of girls with ADHD present primarily with inattentive symptoms, compared to boys who more often show hyperactivity or impulsive symptoms. So this is why so many girls are underdiagnosed or just misdiagnosed. They aren't causing problems for others, they're only causing problems for themselves. The second type or presentation is predominantly hyperactive or impulsive. This is the version that schools recognize because it's the most disruptive, it's the most obvious. So, this presentation reflects deficits in inhibitory control, the brain's braking system. So, neurological studies show that there is reduced activity in brain regions responsible for impulse control. They have difficulty with delaying responses. So they don't have the ability to, think things through before they act. They have heightened emotional reactivity. This is There's an important shift with age because hyperactivity in adults often becomes internal, not physical. So instead of bouncing off the walls, it looks more like racing thoughts, chronic anxiety, overworking, inability to rest. So this is why adults with ADHD are frequently misdiagnosed with anxiety disorders. And the third presentation is a combined presentation. So, combined ADHD reflects multiple executive symptoms being impacted simultaneously. Research shows that this group has higher emotional dysregulation, greater impairment in daily functioning, increased risk for depression and anxiety. This presentation often changes appearance over time, which is why many people believe that ADHD goes away. It doesn't. It learns to adapt. So now that we know that, let's talk about school. School is not designed for the ADHD brain. Schools are set up for sustained attention, for sitting still, for linear instruction, for compliance, for output over processing. But the ADHD brain learns best through engagement, through movement. ADHD brains struggle with long lectures. They need novelty to maintain focus. They process information non-linearly. So, studies show that children with ADHD receive significantly more negative feedback from teachers than their peers, often 20,000 plus more negative comments by their teen years, so by adolescence. So, inattentive kids, they don't even get noticed. They just kind of fall through the cracks. And when children repeatedly fail in environments not designed for them, they internalize it as personal failure. I want to talk about my own story for just a minute. I did not fully understand any of this until I was 16 years old. And even then, I didn't really fully understand what all of it meant for me. So at 16 was when I was diagnosed with what was then called attention deficit disorder. And the thing that led to that diagnosis wasn't behavior problems. It wasn't acting out. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't, you know, all of those things. It wasn't pinging off the wall. I was struggling in school. I was struggling specifically with algebra. And here's the part that still bothers me is I knew it. I knew the formulas. I understood the concepts. If you asked me verbally, I could explain how to do the problem. But when I sat down to actually do it, my brain would not cooperate. I couldn't lock in. I couldn't hold the steps in my head long enough to finish the problem. My attention wouldn't stay where I needed it. And the cost of trying was crushing migraines every day, not mild little headaches, but full debilitating migraines. The light hurt, sound hurt, thinking hurt. And people didn't understand that part because from the outside, it looked like I just wasn't applying myself. But what I was actually experiencing wasn't a lack of intelligence. It wasn't a lack of knowing how to do it or a lack of want to. It was a working memory problem. The working memory in your brain or is your brain's ability to hold information, to manipulate it, to keep track of steps, to stay oriented in task. And algebra is almost entirely working memory. You have to memorize the formula. You have to apply the rule. You have to track what you just did, not forget your place and move to the next step. For an inattentive ADHD brain, that's like trying to keep a dozen tabs open while someone keeps closing them. So when people said, just focus, you know this, try harder, they didn't realize I already was. And I was just losing every ounce of self respect, I guess. I had because I kept going, I know this, but I can't. I just sit down and I just stare at it and I can't do it. And my nervous system was paying the price. As an adult, my ADHD doesn't look like hyperactivity. It looks like starting things with good intentions and struggling to finish them. It looks like spacing out even when I care deeply about what's happening. So I don't lack motivation or ideas. I actually have plenty of both. What I struggle with is sustaining focus and follow through over time. So once the initial energy for something fades, my brain has a hard time staying engaged, even when the task still matters to me. Sometimes my mind just drifts, not because I'm bored or disinterested, not because my attention doesn't stay anchored automatically. I often realize I've lost focus only after it's already happened. It can look inconsistent from the outside. I'm constantly trying to re-engage, to recenter, and pull my attention back where I want it to be. So my ADHD as an adult isn't loud, but it is persistent, and it affects how I manage time, energy, and completion more than anything else. On a humorous note, there are some funny aspects to ADHD. ADHD brains often make connections very quickly, but it struggles to filter out non essential stimuli. So, one word can activate an entire mental chain. So, a word can become a song lyric, a memory, another random thought. And suddenly you're three mental rooms away from where you're started and what you're doing. So my husband gets great enjoyment in saying a word and waiting to see how long it takes before my brain grabs a song and I start singing it. And sometimes this is funny. I can laugh at myself too. I'm calling this one the one word to a full concert effect. Sometimes I interrupt myself mid sentence. I also love buying supplies for new hobbies that I will abandon the second I get even remotely good at it. And when I tell stories, you are going to get the main story plus a dozen side quests. If you are lucky, I will eventually get back to and finish the main story, but there is a slight chance that you will have forgotten what the main story is by then. So there are some humorous aspects to ADHD, but to get back on topic, this is why ADHD without the hyper gets missed so often because it's not disruptive. It's not loud. It's not refusing to work. I wasn't refusing to work. I was sitting there quietly burning through every ounce of mental energy I had. And when I struggled internally, people assume it's optional. She's choosing not to pay attention. She's choosing not to be engaged. But inattentive ADHD isn't about effort. It's about access. I had the knowledge. I just couldn't always access it on demand. I want to talk a minute about the diagnosis gap. So here's where the stats get kind of uncomfortable. Boys are diagnosed with ADHD 2 to 3 times more often than girls in childhood. By adulthood, the gender gap narrows dramatically. So women are often diagnosed in their 30s or 40s. That's mind-boggling to know that you suffered with ADHD your whole life because it didn't start in your 30s or 40s. That's just how long it took for you to get a diagnosis, mainly because girls more often have the inattentive type. So girls are more likely to be diagnosed first with like anxiety, depression, or mood disorders. Why? Because girls are socialized to mask symptoms, internalize distress, to overcompensate, to people please. So girls are more likely to struggle quietly. Now, children versus adults, ADHD, contrary to popular belief, does not just disappear. You don't grow out of it. It just adapts. So, long-term studies show that 60 to 80% of children with ADHD continue to experience symptoms into adulthood. So, adult ADHD is associated with job instability, relationship strain, burnout, chronic stress. Adults with ADHD aren't failing at adulthood. They're managing a brain that was never supported. And there is an emotional cost of undiagnosed ADHD. This is the part people don't talk enough about. Undiagnosed ADHD leads to chronic shame because you're always sitting there going, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just do this like a normal person? They often have low self esteem, again, because they're always beating themselves up for everything they are not doing normally, not able to process normally. They often suffer from perfectionism. They often have fear of failure, emotional dysregulation. So many adults say, I've spent my whole life trying harder than everyone else just to keep up. And that's not laziness, that's survival. So ADHD is not a moral failure. It's not a discipline problem, a phone addiction. It's definitely not something you just grow out of. ADHD is a neurological difference. There is actual neurological differences in the brain. It is a regulation disorder. It is real. It is lifelong. But before we end, I want to zoom out for just a moment because this conversation isn't just about ADHD. It's about how we treat people whose brains don't work like ours. So many struggles are invisible. The person who doesn't finish what they start may not be careless. The person who zones out may not be rude. The person who needs more time may not be lazy. The person who seems inconsistent may not be unreliable. Their brain may simply be working harder than you can see. ADHD without the hyper reminds us of something important. Not all difficulties announce themselves loudly. Some people are fighting battles entirely inside their own minds. So maybe the takeaway here isn't just awareness, it's compassion, pausing before we judge, being curious instead of critical, leaving room for the possibility that someone's brain processes the world differently than ours does. Because when we assume everyone should function the same way, we miss the chance to support one another. So sometimes we just have to ask ourselves, how can I understand this person better? So if this episode helped you recognize something in yourself, I hope you leave with more grace for yourself. And if it helped you recognize someone else, a student, a coworker, a friend, a family member, I hope you leave with more patience, more empathy, and a willingness to see beyond the surface. Different doesn't mean broken. Quiet doesn't mean it's easy, and understanding changes everything. So if this episode meant anything to you, or you think it might mean something to someone else, share it, like it, subscribe to it, and thank you for joining me. And until next time, take care of your mind, take care of your soul, and take care of yourself.